all hope is lost. That's the message coming from the Russian soldiers who are currently fighting against Ukraine in the Yunakiivka pocket in Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. Those troops are starving. They're running out of supplies and equipment. Nothing they can do can save them from the Ukrainian onslaught. And Vladimir Putin doesn't care. Far from doing whatever he can to save his soldiers in Sumy, Putin has abandoned his own troops. Surrounded and doomed, those soldiers have been left to die in Ukraine's kill zone. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which published a report on October 12 that covers what's happening in Yunakiivka and how Putin, along with the rest of the Russians' military top brass, is doing nothing to stop it. The outlet reports that Ukraine has come up with a clever strategy to deal with the Russian forces that have been attempting to create a buffer zone within Sumy since the beginning of summer. Rather than taking on those Russian forces head-on, Ukraine is instead creating fire pockets. These pockets are essentially kill zones, though not in the way one might expect. Yunakiivka has become another of those fire pockets, as Ukraine has encircled the Russian soldiers in that village. It might seem logical that Ukraine would assault Russia's soldiers once the village was encircled. However, that isn't what it's doing. Instead, Euromaidan Press reports, Ukraine is playing the long game by cutting off all supply routes into Yunakiivka so Russia can do nothing to save the soldiers it sent into the village. Not that it would, but that point will be addressed later in the video. Ukraine's tactic seems to be to drive the encircled Russia soldiers crazy with a strategy that's leading to Russian soldiers killing their own comrades for attempting to surrender. Desperation is now king in Yunakiivka. It's all thanks to a simple formula, as Euromaidan Press reports. Take the Russian ground lines of communication under fire control, isolate and starve the Russians in Yunakiivka, and then turn the trap into a kill zone without any chances of evacuation or rotation. It's that formula, and it's working like a dream. Ukraine is playing on a major fault in the Russian military's hierarchy. Surrendering any territory that's been captured is a no-go for Russia's commanders, not least because they'd have to explain what happened to Putin. So, trapped in Ukraine's Yunakiivka kill zone, Russia's commanders won't allow their soldiers to surrender. They should die instead, just as they're doing. Choking off Russian supply lines is a common Ukrainian tactic, and it's been using that tactic a lot in Sumy. On August 25, for example, Ukraine ambushed the convoy carrying Russian Lieutenant General Esadullah Abachev. The general was en route to Sumy to help organize the already failing summer offensive in that region, only for him to be maimed in a Ukrainian drone attack. Interestingly, Ukraine preceded that strike by destroying a bridge close to Yunakiivka. That suggests what is now seen in the village is the result of several weeks of hard work by Ukraine's forces to isolate Russia's soldiers. The Guardian adds that Ukraine has also conducted strikes against several trains that were supposed to provide supplies to Russian troops operating in Sumy, again showcasing a smart strategy of cutting Russia's forces off from what they need to launch assaults. This systematic destruction of supply lines is working wonders in Sumy. Now, Russia's soldiers in Yunakiivka are paying the price. It was mentioned earlier that Ukraine has turned that village into a kill zone, though not the type that one might expect. The country has talked about drone-based kill zones in the past, with the theory being that it uses multiple layers of drones to create no man's lands across the front lines. In September, RBC Ukraine reported that Ukraine was planning to create an 18.6-mile kill zone across the front, for instance. Loaded with drones, that kill zone would serve both as an early warning system for Ukraine's defenders and a means to destroy Russian soldiers before they ever get close to the territory they're trying to take. Ukraine seems to have created a smaller version of this type of kill zone around Yunakiivka. But where it's starting to use kill zones elsewhere, as a complement to assaults designed to retake occupied territory, the kill zone in Yunakiivka is all about making it impossible for the trapped soldiers to escape. That in turn means that Ukraine doesn't have to go on the attack in the village. Euromaidan Press explains why Ukraine doesn't want to do that. Yunakiivka's open layout with scattered and burned out buildings offers no cover and no reason for the Ukrainians to engage in a storming operation, which would only cost losses in an attritional battle that can hardly be won against an opponent with more troops on the ground, the outlet says. Ukraine has no interest in fighting what could be a losing battle to reclaim its lost village. So, as mentioned earlier, it's taking advantage of the Russian desire to hold on to every scrap of territory it claims. Let Russia keep Yunakiivka, Ukraine seems to be saying. Why? Russia soldiers are trapped. They can't leave because Ukraine's drones will kill them, and with their supply lines cut off, Ukraine doesn't even have to attack. Ukraine just has to wait the Yunakiivka occupiers out. Or, perhaps more accurately, starve those occupiers until they have no choice other than surrender or die. Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine knows that it has the advantage everywhere except in terms of pure numbers of soldiers in Yunakiivka. It also points out that Russia's forces have already tried to push out of Yunakiivka, only to have that push destroyed by Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is essentially holding Russia's soldiers in place, keeping them imprisoned in the village they were once so proud to claim. In doing so, Ukraine is also able to use troops that it would have sent to fight for Yunakiivka elsewhere in Sumy, all as the Russian soldiers in that village wait for help that will probably never come. Eventually, those troops will starve, and for many in Ukraine, that will be a form of poetic justice. After all, Russia has a history of using starvation as a tactic against Ukraine. Only, Russia wasn't starving Ukraine's soldiers, instead it targeted civilians. In June 2024, CNN reported that a group of international human rights lawyers had accused Russia of using starvation tactics against the civilians of Mariupol during the 85-day siege of that city in 2022. The findings were part of a 76-page report that detailed how Russia has systematically attacked objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Those objects included electricity substations and water supplies, the latter of which was a serious problem for Mariupol civilians. Without water, they couldn't drink and struggled to make many of the flour-based staples that made up their diets. It could be said that Ukraine is giving Russia's soldiers a taste of their own medicine in Yunakiivka. However, it looks like those soldiers aren't getting a chance to taste much of anything thanks to Ukraine's trap. That trap, Euromaidan Press says, has been built along the road between Yunakiivka and another Sumy settlement named Sudza. Additionally, forested settlements that lead into Yunakiivka are now carpeted with drones and within the sights of Ukraine's artillery. Any Russian soldiers who try to escape Yunakiivka via any of these routes won't last long. Ukraine is also securing the region south of the road it's already claimed, which allows it to create ambush sites that can also take out any escaping Russians. Ultimately, the trap comes down to control. The more of the forested area around Yunakiivka that Ukraine occupies, the fewer the options Russia has for evacuating its trapped soldiers. All Ukraine has left to do is secure and fortify the nearby settlement of Yablunivka, and the trap will be complete. After that's done, the kill zone will become inescapable. Ukraine won't ever have to attack Yunakiivka. It can just wait out the Russian soldiers there, forcing them to either surrender or engage in suicidal escape attempts. By this point, a natural question arises. What does all of this have to do with Putin abandoning his troops? The obvious answer is that Russia is doing very little to rescue the Yunakiivka forces from Ukraine. Granted, Ukraine is making such a rescue very difficult with its encirclement of the village, but Russia doesn't even seem to be trying. It's almost as if Putin has given up the village and the soldiers inside as a lost cause as he focuses elsewhere in Sumy. However, there's more to it than that, Euromaidan Press claims. It says that Ukraine is finding plenty of evidence that Russia is doing little to help any of its Sumy soldiers, be they in Yunakiivka or the nearby areas that Ukraine is currently clearing. Among the dead, Ukrainians found a phone filled with messages and videos of Russian troops complaining of hunger, no rotation, and commanders ignoring their pleas, the outlet says. Euromaidan Press reveals the contents of some of these videos and messages. It says that many of the Russian soldiers in Yunakiivka now talk about never-ending drone attacks and uncaring commanders who order them to engage in counterattacks in the surrounding areas. Those counterattacks never work. The soldiers sent into them rarely come back. Dwindling supplies are another major issue, as already discussed. Not even surrender seems to be an option. The outlet recounts one video in which a pair of Russian soldiers are attempting to leave Yunakiivka so they can surrender to Ukraine's troops. They never come close to making it. As they start walking toward the Ukrainian lines with their hands raised in the air, Russian drones fly above and drop explosive munitions on them to prevent the surrender. That is brutal, and that is Putin's military. It's no wonder that the trapped Unakivka soldiers feel that there's no hope for them. They're getting killed for attempting to surrender, and this is far from the first time that's happened. Back in October 2023, the BBC reported that US officials accused Russia of executing its own soldiers if they attempted to retreat from the bloody battle for Avdiivka. That battle saw Russia lose 5,000 soldiers, 125 armored vehicles, and an entire battalion's worth of equipment before the settlement fell. However, it's the executions of its own that stand out. This comes back to what was mentioned earlier about Russia's desperation to hold on to any territory that it gains. If the country's commanders were willing to kill their own soldiers when trying to capture a settlement, there is no realistic chance that they would allow their troops to then abandon a village. Russia's soldiers exist to fight and die, at least in Putin's mind. And that, combined with Russia seeming to have no inclination to launch a rescue attempt in Unakivka, is how Putin is abandoning his own soldiers. That explains how, but there's a big question to answer. Why? The answer may be that Putin simply doesn't care about his soldiers. That's according to Ukraine's foreign minister, Andrei Sybiha. In June, Sybiha took to X to respond to several of Putin's claims, with one about Russia's own soldiers really standing out. But of all of Putin's deranged statements today, one about the Russian soldier's foot stands out. In reality, wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, he brings along only death, destruction, and devastation, Sybiha said. Putin doesn't care about Russian soldiers on their feet torn apart by Ukrainian drones. He's a mass murderer of his own people. He already disposed 1 million Russian soldiers in a senseless bloodbath in Ukraine without achieving a single strategic goal. 1 million soldiers, 2 million feet. Sybiha's comments were made in response to an earlier Putin claim that anywhere a Russian soldier sets foot belongs to Russia. "I've said it before, Russians and Ukrainians are one people," Putin exclaimed. "In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. There's an old rule that wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, that's ours." Ukraine's foreign minister is pointing out how ridiculous that claim is, especially as so many of Russia's soldiers are dying on land that is supposedly theirs. And dying is what Russia's soldiers are doing, in droves. Sybiha says 1 million Russians are casualties of the Ukraine war, but the number has grown substantially since then. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance highlights that, reporting that Russia has lost 1,123,950 of its soldiers between when Putin launched his invasion and October 13. On October 12 alone, 1,140 Russian soldiers were sacrificed for Putin's ambition, and there'll be many more thousands, perhaps even millions to come, as Putin shows no sign of stopping. Russia's leader is happy to pay the price for Ukraine in the blood of his own soldiers. And the terrible truth is that Russia is still a long way away from getting what it wants. According to Al Jazeera, Russia currently controls approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory. While much of that territory was captured during the initial stages of the invasion, even an approximation of how much that territory has cost Russia reflects very poorly on Putin's strategy. For every percent of Ukraine that Russia has gained, Putin has allowed around 56,197 of his soldiers to be wounded, killed, or captured. There is still 80% of Ukraine to go. If Russia posts the same kinds of numbers to take the rest of Ukraine, it will have lost another 4,495,800 of its soldiers by the time Ukraine is fully under Russian control. That isn't sustainable. But it also doesn't matter to Putin because any gains, no matter how small, are worth the sacrifice. That's according to Politico, which wrote on October 13 that Russia is absolutely bleeding troops for what it calls microscopic gains. During the first 8 months of 2025, the outlet says, Russia has lost 281,550 soldiers to death, injury, or capture. But what's really disturbing is the claim made by a joint report between Media Zona and the BBC that reveals that Russia's rate of deaths to injury is far worse than expected. Due to the lack of a normal system of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers per 1 dead, the report says. This signals a low level of survival of the wounded, who are poorly trained in tactical medicine and are usually abandoned without help after injury. The lack of a system for evacuating soldiers tells the whole story about what's happening in Unakivka. Putin isn't leaving those soldiers to die because Russia can't break through Ukraine's lines to get them, even with Ukraine making that breakthrough as difficult as possible. An evacuation isn't happening because Putin and his cronies care so little about their soldiers that they haven't even bothered to come up with any defined plans on how to evacuate them when they're injured. Why should Putin bother with that? There are millions more Russians he can send to the front lines to replace those that he abandoned. And that thought process leads to the root of why Putin is happy to abandon soldiers who are stuck in Ukraine's trap. Russia's president sees his soldiers as little more than cannon fodder. To him, the trapped Unakivka troops are little more than a potential distraction for Ukraine that might allow Russia to make advances elsewhere. Even with Ukraine taking the slow and steady approach in Unakivka, it's still dedicating soldiers to encircling the settlement. Ukraine still has to use drones and artillery to cut off escape routes. These are all resources that Ukraine can't deploy anywhere else in Sumy, and that's all that Putin really sees. The abandoned troops can die for all Putin cares. At least, that means Ukraine has spent another bullet or bomb. Putin's treatment of his soldiers as cannon fodder was highlighted in an article Leon Aron wrote for The Spectator in October 2024. He pointed out that Russia is now raiding prisons and calling on its youngest people to fight in Ukraine, knowing that many of those he sends will never make it back. Aron concludes his article with a question. How many thousands, or more likely tens of thousands of boys will be killed before Russia begins to oppose the war? Aron asks. For now, no amount of protest from Russia's mothers and wives will stop the Kremlin from turning legions of their husbands and sons into cannon fodder. The soldiers in Unakivka are just numbers to add to those that Putin has already sacrificed. They've outlived their usefulness as an attacking threat, so Putin is happy to let them die. However, there's something about Putin's callous nature that he doesn't seem to know. Abandoning soldiers undermines Russia's combat strength. The Guardian's Jack Watling made that point back in March 2022, and his words have proven prophetic. Russia's ruthless treatment of its own soldiers, while concealable at a small scale, has now brought about operational repercussions, Watling wrote. He went on to point out that Putin and his cronies had failed to tell their soldiers how they were going to wage war after the initial invasion failed. That left Russia with an army that was unprepared, both logistically and psychologically, to fight the kind of war it's now fighting. Planning went out the window, and the slow pace of advance seen following the initial invasion was symptomatic of a military that doesn't care about the people who make it tick. Nothing has changed in the 3.5 years since Watling wrote those words. Russia's pace of advance is still glacial, it's losing more soldiers than ever before, and Putin doesn't seem to care. That's why there's no hope for the Russian troops trapped in Unakivka. By design, Putin's entire war against Ukraine has revolved around sacrificing soldiers to achieve gains. The Unakivka soldiers made a small gain. Now, they're paying a terrible price because Putin refuses to allow his soldiers to do anything other than hold or fight, even when he knows they have no chance of winning. Now, low Russian morale may end up being what undoes Putin's plans in the end. In fact, that very issue may be on its way to causing the collapse of the Russian army. Putin's military is bleeding troops as 70,000 of Russia's soldiers have gone AWOL due to the type of treatment Putin subjects them to. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering what's happening in the Sumy direction.